How did this end up costing $70 million? And what does the CIA have to do with it? Hello, everyone. I'm Nina Ninashev, and today we're going to look into the most controversial question about art, its value. And this will be one of the most useful videos on my channel where I will honestly and clearly lay out all the secrets of the art business for you, secrets that other art historians will never tell you about. Make yourself comfortable. Let's get started. At all times, up until the middle of the 19th century, art was simply a craft. There was an artist, his workshop, and a client. The price depended on three factors: the artist's name, the size of the canvas, and the number of figures on it. Because drawing people was the hardest part, many portrait artists even had a strict price list. Head and shoulders was one price, a half-length portrait was twice as expensive, and a full-length figure was the maximum rate. If the client asked to add a background, a purebred dog, a horse, or a complex landscape, the price increased proportionally. The artist and the client would usually agree on an approximate price, the subject and the size of the painting, sign a contract, and the artist would receive an advance against a signed receipt and then begin the work. During the process, changes could arise that affected the price, but the artist's basic standard price per square centimeter or inch of canvas was always known in advance. Expensive pigments, especially ultramarine made from lapis lazuli, which was hundreds of times more expensive than other paints, were often paid for separately by the client or specified in the contract as a mandatory condition. From the many workshops available, the client would choose one according to his budget and order his portrait or some heroic painting to later hang it on the wall of his cold and empty castle or estate as a decoration. In a big city, there were always many workshops that engaged in regular commercial competition with each other for clients, offering discounts and other incentives, and land bigger fish for their portfolio. Usually, the clients were wealthy nobles, the church, or businessmen. The most prestigious thing was to become an official court painter, or even better, a royal painter. Only they were allowed to paint portraits of royal families. This immediately put the artist at the very top of the art pyramid and allowed him to set the highest price for his work. Having a portrait at home painted by the artist who paints the monarch himself was considered extremely prestigious. The standard was a step-by-step process. Usually, a third or half of the amount was paid in advance for the purchase of canvas, stretcher, and paints, and the rest upon completion. The client or his representative, some intellectual on the payroll, would discuss the plot, characters, and setting, and the artist would begin the work. But before starting on the canvas, the artist was required to present the client with a small oil sketch known as a modello, or a detailed drawing. The client would approve it, make corrections, make the facial expression more stern, change this dress, add more jewelry please, and then sign it. This sketch became the main legal attachment to the contract, which recorded the agreements. The contract also specified exactly who from the workshop would work on the painting. Each large workshop had many apprentices, and they were often responsible for the secondary parts of the depiction. The master's own time was too valuable and limited, and he wanted to take on as many commissions as possible, so usually the master would only paint the human figures himself, leaving the rest to the apprentices. That's why contracts often specified very clearly the extent of the master's personal involvement in the artwork, because clients were terribly afraid that, for a huge sum of money, they would be given a painting made by an unknown apprentice. And this happened everywhere. Not all artists were honest and noble. Sometimes, to make more money, they cut corners. And if a sufficiently talented apprentice was found in the workshop, he could secretly be entrusted with painting the face. Then the master would simply put his signature on the canvas. In such cases, it was extremely difficult for the client to determine the real authorship. That's exactly why we so often hear nowadays about the difficulties of attributing paintings. A master's signature on a painting didn't always indicate actual involvement in its creation. And this is quite a complicated problem. By an artist's individual style, by a characteristic brushstroke, or by some particular way of depicting a face, eyes, or lips, it's very difficult to determine the exact authorship of a painting when 500 years have passed since its creation. As you can see, artists had virtually no freedom within the framework of a commission. They simply did what they were ordered to do, just like this atelier. Of course, every artist had their own style, their own tricks and techniques, but in general, it usually came down to how realistically and accurately the artist could fulfill the commission. Portrait quality was mainly judged by facial likeness and status portrayal. If the portrait didn't resemble the person, or on the contrary, if the artist made the client's face too realistic without the proper amount of flattery, which could be painful for less attractive individuals, the client could refuse to accept the work until it was corrected. That's why there were constant heated arguments and even lawsuits between artists and clients. Watch my video about El Greco. He very cleverly used loopholes in the commission system to earn himself a reputation. I'll leave the link in the description. Now I'll give a couple of interesting examples. They perfectly illustrate the financial relationship between artists and clients. The English painter William Hogarth received a commission in 1750 from the wealthy banker Sir Richard Grosvenor. The banker gave the artist complete freedom to choose the subject and promised to pay any amount he named. Hogarth decided to paint a dramatic and tragic picture, Sigismunda mourning over the heart of her husband Guiscardo, based on a novella by Boccaccio. The painting depicted a weeping woman clutching a goblet with a real human heart. When Grosvenor saw the finished result, he was horrified. He found the painting too gloomy, bloody, and, I quote, inappropriate for a respectable living room. The banker tried to delicately cancel the deal by writing Hogarth a letter in which he praised his skill, but claimed he couldn't own something that caused so much sorrow. He suggested the artist keep the painting. You see, the painting wasn't really suitable to hang in the living room. Imagine guests coming over in a good mood to chat and gossip, and then there's this unfortunate lady with a living heart in a glass. It's kind of improper, inappropriate, you know? Hogarth was furious, considering it an insult to his talent. It didn't go to court, but a public scandal broke out. Hogarth officially released the banker from his obligations, returned the advance, and swore never to work for private clients again, returning to making engravings for the general public. He never sold his paintings during his lifetime. But most often, disputes arose because of deadlines. Artists, being creative and disorganized individuals, constantly missed deadlines, and poor clients often had to literally beg the artist to finish the work as soon as possible, especially if the painting was commissioned for some important event or a housewarming. For example, the greatest pastelist of France, Maurice Quentin de la Tour, received a commission to create a huge ceremonial portrait of the official mistress of Louis XV. Madame de Pompadour. The portrait was needed for the opening of an important salon. The work lasted for as long as 3 years, because Latour had a difficult character and demanded complete obedience from the influential client during the posing sessions. When the painting was finished, Latour, having calculated the time spent on it, presented an incredible bill for that time, 48,000 livres. The Marquise de Pompadour, despite her wealth, considered the amount absurd and outrageous. And so it was. She offered the artist a reasonable 24,000 livres, half the price, but even that amount seemed fantastic. Latour flatly refused to lower the price, stating that his time and unique pastel technique were not up for negotiation, and if the Marquise didn't have the money, he would keep the portrait for himself. Latour was basically blackmailing the court by threatening not to hand over the portrait in time for the salon opening. The court simply had no choice. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Marquise paid half the amount, and the artist was compensated for the other half by providing him with official government housing and a prestigious studio right in the Louvre. The Royal Picture Gallery of the Louvre at that time served not only as home to the royal family's art collection, but also as a residence for the best court artists. As you can see, paintings were sometimes created over the course of years, especially the large and complex ones, which is why even back then they were quite expensive. But even the most expensive paintings by the most renowned masters, for example in France, usually did not cost more than 10,000 livres. The case described above was more of a scandalous exception. For that amount of money, you could buy a small country estate or secure a modest lifelong income if you put it in the bank. In today's money, that's about $250,000 to $300,000. And in the middle of the 17th century, an important event took place. In 1667, by order of Louis XIV, the French Royal Academy of Arts held the first exhibition of its students' works. Initially, these were closed semi-private showings, but in 1725, the exhibition moved to the square salon of the Louvre Palace. That's where the historical name salon came from. In 1737, the salon became public and free for all citizens. It was held once every 2 years at the end of summer and attracted incredible crowds, up to 500,000 people per season. The paintings were hung using the tapestry method, covering the walls from bottom to top, from floor to ceiling, what is now called salon-style hanging, which is almost never used anymore. Any artist could participate in the salon, but they had to pass a strict selection by the academicians. If the jury accepted a painting and moreover awarded it a medal, the artist instantly became a star. His prices would increase 5 to 10 times, and a line of wealthy bourgeois would form to buy his works. If the jury rejected the artist, he was in fact left without any means of subsistence. Thus, for almost 150 years, the Salon jury became the main authority in evaluating painting in the world. That is, just 30 or 40 people, the number of academicians constantly changed, determined the fate of all art in Europe. So patrons, artists, and academicians lived side by side, quarreling, deceiving each other, placing orders, boasting, and competing until the situation changed. And it would change with the emergence of a new institution that would transform the very approach to art. And this is a very important building block in our story. This happened around the middle of the 18th century and brought about a real revolution. As you've already gathered, up until that moment, art was private. A patron would commission a painting for his bedroom, and it would hang there for many years, visible only to the owner, his family, and friends, serving a purely decorative function. An ordinary person who couldn't afford to buy a painting could only see art in a church or in some government institution. For a very long time, painting remained inaccessible to the majority of people until museums appeared. The first step was the opening of private royal collections to a select public. Pope Clement XII in the 18th century opened a collection of antiquities to the residents of Rome, pursuing purely educational goals. Then the Uffizi Gallery in Florence followed. The last representative of the Medici family, Anna Maria Luisa Medici, bequeathed the family collection to the city on the condition that it would never leave Florence and would always be accessible to the public. But the true birth of the public art museum happened during the French Revolution. In 1793, the new Republican government nationalized the Royal Palace of the Louvre and the entire collection of the deposed Louis XVI. And based on this collection, the first major public museum was created. The museum was established with an ideology that was completely new for those times, very much in tune with the revolution itself. Art no longer belongs to the king, it belongs to the entire nation. The doors of the Louvre were open to all citizens for free. At first, though, only 3 days a week, and priority was given to artists who wanted to make copies. Museums began to systematize art by eras and national schools. Gradually, whatever ended up within the museum walls automatically gained the status of an absolute standard, a masterpiece. Getting into a museum became the most desired goal for any artist, the highest level of recognition for their talent. A division emerged between museum artists and everyone else. If a collector planned to buy a painting by an artist whose works were already hanging in the Louvre or the Uffizi, the price of such a work on the market was several times higher. The museum became the main mark of quality, the highest institution and the arbiter of artists' legacies. Soon, museums themselves became powerful players in the market. They began to purchase private collections, as for example, the British government did when it began building the National Gallery in London in 1824. Museums also began to hold exhibitions, just like the Salon exhibitions, but at the salons, it was contemporary art by living masters that was displayed, fresh, newly created works. But museums kept old masters' works. The Louvre Museum essentially served as a hall of fame. If a contemporary artist successfully exhibited at the salons, the state could purchase his painting for the national collections, which meant immortality for the author in history and a rise in the price of his work. Everything seemed fine, except for one thing. Once art became public, it became accessible to a huge number of people who didn't understand anything about it. And if earlier the value of a painting was determined by the client, an aristocrat, according to his own taste, now, when art was put on public display, there appeared people who professionally explained to the uninitiated public what was good and what was bad. The public itself needed this, lacking experience in dealing with lofty matters. Art criticism and expert appraisal were born, as well as another important player in the modern structure of the art world, art dealers. Back then, they were called marchands, and now they're called art dealers, the very same experts. In the 18th century, marchands were still modest intermediaries. They would come to the salon, look out for promising artists, buy their works, and resell them in their shops, mostly dealing with new painters. They themselves did not determine the value of the paintings, acting simply as intermediaries between the salon's approval and the buyer. But soon everything would change. Dealers couldn't argue with the salon. If the salon considered an artist to be bad, the dealer couldn't sell his painting at all. The salon had an absolute monopoly on artistic taste, and museums hung on the salon's every word. However, it was also at the end of the 18th century that another phenomenon appeared: the last important participant in the structure of the art market and another hero of our story. At the end of the 18th century, London became the world capital of the art market. Two factors contributed to this: the enormous influx of capital into the British Empire from the colonies and economic upheavals in continental Europe, especially in France. As a result, masterpieces of art were being sold en masse and taken across the English Channel. It was precisely in the 1760s that the English aristocracy made the grand tour, mandatory journeys of young nobles across Europe through France and Italy, a tradition. From there, they brought back huge quantities of ancient statues, old master paintings, Italian marble, and French furniture to decorate their country estates. As a result, a large bourgeois class emerged in Britain who became incredibly wealthy from colonial profits. They weren't always aristocrats and didn't always have manners, but they were fantastically rich. And in those days, the only thing that couldn't be bought with money was access to high society and aristocratic prestige. That's why English nouveau riche looked for ways to buy themselves status by acquiring something noble, prestigious, and refined. Art was a perfect fit. And of course, in such an atmosphere, it was inevitable that a player would emerge who could take maximum advantage of this. Этим воспользуется. That person was James Christie. Before starting his own business, Christie, after leaving the Navy, became an assistant to one of London's first auctioneers, Thomas Hall, who dealt in antiques and all sorts of odds and ends. In his office, James learned the auction business from the inside and observed the following. The auctions of that time resembled dirty, noisy flea markets in port districts, where everything was sold, from hay and livestock to used clothing. Mostly, auctions sold the belongings of bankrupt people and those in desperate financial situations. Aristocrats thought it was beneath them to go and send their servants instead. Christie thought, if you change the atmosphere itself and raise the standard of the items being sold, it might be possible to get wealthy people to attend the auctions in person and spend serious money there. He was acquainted with London's bohemian set, and it was these friends from the world of high art who pointed out to Christie that there was a huge problem in the painting and antiques market. Selling paintings through small shady dealers to aristocrats was inconvenient and shameful. What was needed was a truly glamorous venue. When Christie opened his halls in Pall Mall, the most expensive district of London, in 1766, he took full advantage of this need. First of all, he refused to sell household junk. His catalogs featured only paintings, jewelry, expensive porcelain, fine wine, and antiques. Secondly, he turned the auction into a theatrical performance. Christie, in the latest fashion and a powdered wig, personally conducted the auction. His manner of speaking was so refined and his compliments to the buyers so subtle that lords and ladies would come there simply for entertainment, like going to the opera. James Christie was the first to realize that the newly rich were not just buying a canvas or an old statue, they were buying status, an atmosphere of exclusivity and excitement, the chance to be in the same room as aristocrats. This idea is what created one of the most famous auction houses to this day, Christie's. Christie turned auctions into a high society spectacle. His most resounding victory in the 18th century was the sale in 1779 of the unique painting collection of the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, Robert Walpole. Christie acted as an intermediary, and the entire collection was bought in its entirety by the Russian Empress Yekaterina II. For the Hermitage, for a huge sum of £40,500 sterling, which in today's money amounts to $1.2 billion. Thus, a new sales scheme emerged, competing with art dealers. The price of a painting in a dealer's shop was always a secret for the buyer. The dealer would name a price off the top of his head, judging by the status and wealth of the buyer. This led to suspicions of deception and distrust. At the auction, however, open market competition emerged. The price would rise before everyone's eyes. The buyer could see his competitors and understood that if the price was high, it meant the item was truly in demand. This inspired more trust among the new class of wealthy bourgeois who didn't understand anything about art but had plenty of money. Traditional dealers offered a calm, private purchase, while Christie's turned buying art into a sport and a game of chance. Public auctions sent adrenaline soaring. The rivalry among the lords for a rare canvas was fueled by the audience, which made people overpay huge amounts under the influence of the moment. If an aristocrat urgently needed money, for example, to cover card debts, it was not profitable to go to a traditional dealer. The dealer knew the seller was desperate and would drop the price as much as possible, since he could keep the painting for years. Auction houses guaranteed a quick and large-scale sale of all property at once on a fixed date. This made auctions the main tool for liquidating estates and bankruptcies. Traditional dealers initially tried to boycott auctions, but quickly realized they were losing. Eventually, they adapted and found their niche. Dealers themselves became the main buyers at auctions. They bought items there in bulk and then resold them in their galleries to clients who didn't want to appear publicly at auctions. Dealers also started acting as agents. Wealthy lords were often embarrassed or afraid to bid themselves, so they hired them as intermediaries to bid on their behalf in Christie's sale rooms or, more than 100 years later, at Sotheby's. The end of the 18th century became a turning point for the financial structure of the entire art world. Look how interesting this is. It was at this time that the beginnings of the art market as we know it today took shape. Two institutions, the museum and the salon, were responsible for determining the quality of art and the value of the artist's name. Имени художника. Two, auctions and dealers, served as experts and intermediaries, shaping the final price of the product and directly selling paintings. At first, the new rules did not have much impact on the price of paintings, because mostly works by living masters were being sold. They were sold for 50 to 200 guineas, $10,000 to $40,000 at most. Almost the same price as a good but not famous contemporary artist sells for today. As for the old masters, almost all of them had been bought by museums and appeared on the market very rarely. There was a shortage of old masters, while the new bourgeoisie had more and more money. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing across Europe, creating yet another class of wealthy people, factory owners and industrialists, who were simply swimming in money. And there is nothing more desirable for a nouveau riche than to acquire something truly valuable, something historical, something from up there, from the very top, from the aristocracy, to buy themselves status, even if it's just painted on. In 1823, the collection of George Watson Taylor was put up for auction. The painting by Rubens, Landscape with the Castle of Steen, was sold at Christie's for a phenomenal 1,500 guineas, which is about 290,000 today's dollars. Next came the sensation and scandal of 1876, the portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire by Thomas Gainsborough. This painting caused a lot of buzz even before it was sold. It was painted by the outstanding portraitist Thomas Gainsborough. He captured the Duchess, who, by the way, was Princess Diana's great-grandmother, in a huge black hat with feathers, which, after the painting was unveiled, instantly became the height of fashion and went down in history as the Gainsborough hat. Then this painting mysteriously disappeared from the family collection and 50 years later was found in the home of an elderly schoolteacher who had cut off the bottom so the canvas would fit above her fireplace. She sold the trimmed masterpiece to an art dealer for a mere £56. Years later, the painting ended up with the collector Wynne Willis, and after his death, it was put up for auction at Christie's. On May 6, 1876, a real drama unfolded at the auction. The leading dealers of that time fought for the right to own the portrait. In the end, the painting was sold for a record, absolutely astronomical sum for those times, 10,000 guineas, $2 million. $2 миллиона сегодня. Was acquired by the prestigious London art dealer William Agnew. At that moment, it was the highest price ever paid for a painting at auction in human history. Agnew displayed the painting in his gallery, but 3 days later it was stolen by the most famous criminal mastermind of that time, who became the prototype for Dr. Moriarty, Adam Worth, simply by cutting it out of the frame. He needed the painting to buy his brother's release from prison, but it turned out to be unnecessary, and for 25 years he carried this treasure in the false bottom of his suitcase, until finally, old and frail, he agreed to secretly sell it in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Agnew's son gladly bought back the portrait for $25,000, but immediately resold it to the American banker George Morgan for a colossal $150,000, which is about $6 million today, thus recouping the buyback price sixfold. And this is another important ingredient that directly affects the value of paintings, provenance, or its history. If a painting was stolen, or if it is connected to some story from the artist's life, or if it itself became a sensation or a significant phenomenon, this multiplies its value several times over. But pay attention to where such a fantastic initial sale price came from. It wasn't the buyer, the artist, or even the museum who set the price. It was the dealer, in order to resell it later for even more. In other words, the price was purely speculative. A speculator set a record price for art for the first time. Remember that. And what's also important is that it was a painting by the old master, Rubens. There was huge demand for old masters, but almost no supply. Paintings by old masters were rarely put on the market, and every such appearance caused a stir. The maximum price for an old master rose to a new level, and in the minds of wealthy people, this usually means that such a price is now also acceptable. On one condition, that there is enough spare cash for the purchase and the new bourgeois had money to burn. And it all seems logical. Old masters are in short supply, the fortunes of the new bourgeois are growing, and paintings by old masters, ownership of which was the most significant proof of status for non-aristocrats, naturally would gradually increase in price in proportion to the growth of fortunes capable of affording such a purchase. But how did it happen that contemporary art, sometimes with highly questionable aesthetic qualities, has come to cost amounts comparable to, and often even greater than, those of the old masters? Why was this painting by Cy Twombly sold for $70 million and an abstraction by Jackson Pollock for $86 million? And here, once again, the dealers are to blame, or rather, one dealer. In the mid-19th century, the academic jury of the Salon became extremely conservative. It demanded smooth painting, classical subjects, and stubbornly ignored the new reality. When young artists, the future Impressionists Edouard Manet, Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, and Renoir brought their works with bright colors and visible brushstrokes, the Salon rejected them en masse. In 1863, the Salon jury rejected more than 3,000 paintings. The scandal was so great that Emperor Napoleon III personally ordered the opening of an alternative exhibition, Salon des Refusés. This was the first critical crack in the state's monopoly. It was at this moment that a new breed of visionary art dealers emerged, the most prominent of whom was Paul Durand-Ruel. You can learn more about him in my video on Impressionism. I'll leave the link in the description. It's very interesting. Paul Durand-Ruel didn't just take over and reshape the art market, he essentially created it anew. Before him, art dealers were passive resellers who waited for the Academy to give an artist a mark of quality at the Salon. Durand-Ruel turned the gallerist into a producer, investor, and the main market maker. His path to the top is a story of enormous risk, balancing on the verge of bankruptcy and inventing art business methods. Paul inherited a small shop of stationery supplies and paintings in Paris from his father. The turning point came in the 1860s when he became fascinated by the artists of the Barbizon school, Camille Corot, Théodore Rousseau, Charles-François d'Aubigny. The official Salon disliked their realistic landscapes, calling them dirty and unfinished. Durand-Ruel took a risk. He bought their works by the dozens. When, a few years later, the public finally saw the beauty of the Barbizon painters, their prices soared, and Paul made his first fortune, formulating his main rule. The greatest profit lies where society does not yet see value. You need to find something that is not yet valued, buy it, and wait until it becomes more expensive. This principle will still apply in 100 years, so wait for the story's end. And then the Impressionists appear, revolutionaries, creators of a new style and completely new techniques that no one believes in, and everyone calls them talentless. I'll refer you to my Impressionist video, be sure to watch it. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War began. To save his paintings, Durand-Ruel went to London and opened a gallery on New Bond Street. There, the Barbizon painter d'Aubigny introduced him to a young French refugee, the future father of Impressionism, Claude Monet. And in turn, he introduced Paul to Camille Pissarro, another father of Impressionism, about whom there will be a video soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Durand-Ruel was captivated by their new experiments with light and saw the future in it. After returning to Paris, he met the rest of the group, Degas, Renoir, Sisley, Monet. The dealer purchased hundreds of their works when all of Paris mocked them. In 1872, in a single day, he bought 23 paintings from Edouard Manet for an impressive 35,000 francs. That's about $30,000 in today's money per painting, while the standard price was no more than $20,000. He also bought many paintings by Monet, Degas, and Sisley, spending his entire fortune on them. And by 1874, he was on the verge of bankruptcy because no one wanted to buy these paintings. As a result, he had to sell a significant portion of these paintings to other dealers and a few collectors with minimal markup, and sometimes even at cost, just to survive. But he continued to support the Impressionists, and in 1874, with his help, the first Impressionist exhibition was organized. The Paris art world was so conservative that it rejected new ideas for a long time and thought he was crazy, while the dealer spent enormous effort and money on what everyone considered junk. Durand-Ruel continued to buy up paintings and keep them in storage, sometimes being the only buyer for the new generation of artists. And this went on for another 15 years until 1888, when Durand-Ruel took the Impressionist paintings to the United States. And in the US at that time, everything from old Europe was worth its weight in gold. Just as the old masters were valued in Europe, the new but European masters were valued in the United States. The public in the United States was free in its views. There was no brutal, stifling academy, and there were just as many extremely wealthy people there. And they were very hungry for status items from Europe. The Impressionist works were very successful in the US. For example, Edouard Manet's painting The Battle Between the Kearsarge and the Alabama, one of only 2 paintings that Durand-Ruel kept out of the 23 he bought 15 years earlier, was sold for 25,000 francs. Let me remind you, all 23 paintings were bought by him for 35,000 francs. 25,000 francs is about $560,000 today. By that time, Monet had already died, and his paintings, of course, had increased in value, as usually happens after the death of any artist. However, despite the fact that this was an absolute record for paintings by new artists, and compared to the works of living Impressionists, which were sold for 2,000 or 3,000 francs, this was astronomical. Living and fashionable artists of the official salon, such as Ernest Meissonier and William Bouguereau, sold their new giant canvases for 100 to 150,000 francs and more. Let me highlight one important point here. Whereas before the price of a painting was set by the patron and everything was straightforward, by this point a new situation had emerged. Paintings were no longer just made on commission. Durand-Ruel, by buying up Impressionist paintings, created a completely new sales scheme. Artists would first paint the pictures and then a buyer would be found for them. That is, the artist was no longer controlled by anyone except the actual sales results and the dealer's opinion. Moreover, the Impressionist technique of painting quickly in just a couple of days significantly reduced the cost of each canvas and the risks that the artist faced with each painting in case of failure. With the help of Durand-Ruel, artists were able to work on spec however they wanted and realize any ideas that came to their minds without spending years on a single painting and without much fear that no one would buy it. Durand-Ruel created a buffer period of as much as 15 years, which allowed new artists to paint, experiment, develop, and not starve, while the market gradually and reluctantly got used to the new art. This is a super important moment when the artist creatively broke free from the control of the patron. The patron, as an active figure in the financial scheme of selling paintings, was gradually leaving the stage. The price, the value of art, no longer came from outside, with a commission or a purchase at an auction, but began to be formed within the art community by the artist himself and his dealer, and only then was the painting put up for sale to an unspecified pool of buyers. A painting used to be a product intended for a specific buyer. A painting for a buyer became an ordinary market commodity when its creator, not knowing who would buy it, left the final sale price largely determined by the agent's resourcefulness and inventiveness in dealing with the market. Thus, 2 important turning points occurred. Painting became a commodity and the vast American market was discovered, which was ready to buy modern European art at a decent price. Dealers poured into Europe from America, and this immediately affected prices in Europe as well. Already in 1895, Claude Monet, a living Impressionist, sold his Rouen Cathedral for 15,000 francs at a solo exhibition, and this was a living artist of the new wave. Some of the most outstanding and meticulously crafted canvases from this series, as well as from the later London series featuring Parliament, were sold by Durand-Ruel to collectors for 20, 25, and even 30,000 francs. For 30,000 francs at that time, you could buy a decent country house. But for 150,000 francs, which living academic painters sold their paintings for, you could buy a luxurious mansion in the center of Paris. In 100 years, the price of classical painting increased 5-fold, while the new art only reached the level of classical art from a century ago. So, look, by the beginning of the 20th century, old masters and contemporary classics were already worth up to several million modern dollars. But although contemporary art was growing, it still only reached a maximum of $500,000. And then comes the most pivotal and, in some ways, dramatic moment, which will become key to understanding why contemporary art is so expensive. The commercial success of the Impressionists led the art world to rush into experimenting in an attempt to replicate their success. Every artist dreamed of finding a new approach to become the founder of their own ism. Pointillism, Fauvism, Cubism, Rayonism, Expressionism, and Surrealism appeared, and all of them began to experiment with new ways to depict reality. What new ways can be used to depict objects from the real world so that they are unique, yet recognizable, and evoke emotions in the viewer? And very often, the viewer didn't understand these experiments. The viewer was used to the idea that art was created to please the eye and the soul. You can't say that the new experimental art immediately won over the public. The public resisted, but the situation has already changed. A group of experts has emerged and grown, acting as a bridge between artists and buyers. The buyers themselves often didn't know enough about art, but they had money, so they hired experts, those very art dealers. And for the first time, a situation of de facto conflict of interest arose when the seller was also the one evaluating the quality of the product. Of course, in this situation, the seller can't criticize his own product. And the buyer was often no longer able to appreciate the beauty of the new art. It was too complex to understand, and he relied on the expert. The market responded to new art in a new way. If it took decades for the Impressionists to be recognized, the avant-garde of the early 20th century, thanks to the gallery system already established by Durand-Ruel, captured the minds and wallets of collectors much faster. However, each movement had its own financial fate. Cubism, Picasso, Braque, Gris became the first avant-garde movement to turn into a hugely successful commercial project. And behind this stood one man, the German gallerist Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. Kahnweiler copied and improved Durand-Ruel's methods. He signed strict exclusive contracts with Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, buying up absolutely everything they produced. He forbade them from exhibiting at official salons and told them to go only to Kahnweiler's gallery. This created an aura of a secret society and exclusivity. Before World War I, Kahnweiler bought Picasso's works for an average of 200, 250, or 500 francs per canvas, which is about $10,000 in today's money. Only a few people bought them: Russian merchants Sergei Shukin and Ivan Morozov, and the American Gertrude Stein. And in 1904, the first art investment fund in history was created. A group of 13 bourgeois pooled their money and spent 10 years buying up works by modernists, including Picasso. In 1914, they held a grand auction in Paris to lock in their profits. A painting by Picasso, Family of Saltimbanques, bought by the fund for 1,000 francs was sold for 11,500 francs. That's about $250,000. The market realized that Cubist paintings are a good investment. In 10 years, the price of the painting increased tenfold. That's 100% annual return. Very few businesses on earth could offer such returns. But in Germany and Austria, expressionists like the Bridge Group, the Blue Rider, and Egon Schiele were selling in a completely different atmosphere. Here, the domestic market, not international capital, played the key role. Until 1914, sales were difficult. The public was conservative, but gallery owners like Herwarth Walden promoted them through their own magazines. Paintings by Vasily Kandinsky and Kirchner were relatively inexpensive, from 100 to 800 marks, that's about $1,000 to $6,000. But in the 1920s, during the era of the Weimar Republic, the golden age of Expressionism began. German museums in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Dresden were the first in the world to start massively acquiring avant-garde works for their state collections. And there were also wealthy local industrialist collectors. Prices soared to the level of 5,000 to 15,000 marks, which is about $100,000 to $110,000. Surrealism, Salvador Dali, René Magritte, Max Ernst, Joan Miro, which emerged in the 1920s, was sold through scandals and shock value. At first, the leader of the movement, Henri Breton, completely despised commerce, but artists needed something to eat. The first exhibitions of Ernst and Miro brought in only pennies. Paintings were sold privately among a small circle of wealthy French aristocrats for 1,000 to 3,000 wartime francs, about $2,500. Everything changed when Dali entered the game. His brilliant shock marketing, appearing in a diving suit, and scandalous lectures attracted the attention of American dealers. In the 1930s, Dali went to the United States. An American syndicate of collectors paid him a fixed salary, buying all his works. His paintings from the late 1930s were already worth $2,000 to $5,000, huge money for the era of the Great Depression, the equivalent of $50,000 to $100,000 today. As you can see, the public was gradually getting used to buying avant-garde art, and the artists kept searching for new approaches until they ran out of new ideas. And then the final leap happened. The artists abandoned depicting real objects and moved into complete abstraction. Kandinsky, Mondrian, and later Malevich took the final step and abandoned representation. Dadaism was the final step, which emerged during World War I as a total protest against the logic of bourgeois society and the high academic culture that allowed the carnage in Europe. The main rebels were Marcel Duchamp, Tristan Tzara, and Hans Arp. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp, as a challenge and almost as a joke, did something that would ultimately and irreversibly change art. He bought an ordinary porcelain urinal from a store, turned it upside down, signed it with the fictitious name Armat, and submitted it to an exhibition under the title Fountain. It was both a challenge and a first attempt at a new concept. The artist no longer even needed to know how to draw or sculpt. His main strength is conceptual choice. Abstractionists and Dadaists basically declared that from now on, the quality of an art object is no longer important at all. The main thing is the concept, the idea that the artist brings to the work. It could be construction debris, paint splatters, or two chairs glued together, but if there's an artist's idea behind it, then it's already art. That was the idea. In other words, the artist voiced and tried to popularize the idea that art no longer has to be attractive or even appeal to the viewer. They tried to take a desperate step to move away from the last organ controlling the viewer's reaction, us, the audience. And at first, this had no success. Louise Bourgeois' first works were simply thrown in the trash. The first abstractions by Joan Miro and Kandinsky were sold for next to nothing. The bourgeoisie, museums, and auction houses simply ignored these stripes and squares on canvas, not recognizing them as art. Big money remained indifferent to abstract art for a long time. Everything changed when big money joined forces with artists, and this happened in the United States. It should be noted here that the United States has always saw itself as playing catch-up to Europe. They didn't have their own deep school and history of art, they didn't have their own famous Impressionists, but they had a lot of money and a more open mindset. If in Europe, which was used to classical and representational art, abstraction was taking root with great difficulty, in the United States there was no such attachment to history, and people there were ready to take risks. The first such figure in the United States was Katharina Dreyer, a wealthy heiress and at the same time an artist. In 1920, together with Marcel Duchamp, she created the Société Anonyme, which was practically the first mobile museum of modern art in the United States. Dreyer personally bought works by Malevich, Kandinsky, and Mondrian in Berlin and Paris when they cost mere pennies, between $200 and $500, and she persistently toured them around American cities, giving lectures and trying to promote a new way of seeing. And in 1929, MoMA was opened, probably the most renowned museum of modern art in the world today. It was opened in New York by three wealthy women who were later called the daring ladies in the art community. They were Abby Rockefeller, the wife of John Rockefeller Jr., heir to the Standard Oil empire. She was the main driving force behind the idea. Interestingly, her husband couldn't stand modern art and flatly refused to give any money for this whim. That's why Abby spent her own money from her independent budget. The second was Lily Bliss, the heiress of a major textile magnate. She was a passionate collector, buying works by Cézanne, Seurat, Degas, Gauguin, and financially supporting avant-garde artists. The third was Mary Sullivan, the wife of a successful corporate lawyer, a collector, and an art teacher. The women rented a modest space of 6 rooms in an ordinary office building in Manhattan with their own funds. Abby Rockefeller used her connections to bring other wealthy Americans onto the board of trustees. The first president of the museum agreed to be the well-known financier and collector Conger Goodyear, who also invested a lot of money and helped build the museum's business model. Later, when the museum proved its success, even the initially skeptical John Rockefeller Jr. softened his stance. And eventually, in 1936, he donated land on 53rd Street to the museum, where the new famous MoMA building stands today. But the definitive commercial breakthrough for abstraction happened in the 1930s when major American capital entered the game. Steel magnate Solomon Guggenheim, under the influence of his advisor, the German artist Hilla von Ribbe, became inspired by the idea of non-objectivity. Guggenheim began buying works from Wassily Kandinsky by the dozens and hundreds and started building a separate museum for modern art. And in May 1939, on Manhattan's East 54th Street, the direct predecessor of the modern museum, the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, opened. Hilaire von Ribé became its first director and curator. The famous architectural masterpiece of the modern Guggenheim Museum in the form of a spiral would be built 20 years later in 1959. Thus, in the 1930s, New York saw two modern art museums appear. Before that moment, there were no modern art museums in the world at all. And you remember that the highest authority and divine goal for any artist were museums, but they were focused only on the classics. And unable to break into the classical museums, modern art built its own. Unable to gain recognition from market experts, modern art bought it with the help of generous American investors, and this investment paid off many times over. When the art market saw that one of the richest people on the planet was building a huge museum in the center of New York, specifically for these colorful spots and lines, the value of abstract art as art for the elite skyrocketed. Do you understand what happened? No one saw any value in the avant-garde until huge amounts of money started being invested in it by people directly connected to the art market. But the commercial legitimization of Duchamp's ready-made only happened half a century later. In the 1960s, a pop art craze exploded in the US and Europe thanks to Andy Warhol. Young artists declared Duchamp their god. Everyone wanted to have those legendary objects in their collections, but the originals were in the trash. And then, in 1964, the Milanese gallerist Arturo Schwarz, with the consent of 77-year-old Duchamp, released an official licensed reissue, a run of the main ready-mades. 8 numbered copies of each item were made, including the fountain, the bicycle wheel, and so on, and Duchamp personally signed them, even though he didn't take part in their creation. And on October 15, 1958, Sotheby's held the legendary auction of the so-called Goldschmidt collection, which became successful thanks to good publicity. Wilson turned an ordinary routine sale into a grand evening event with a strict black-tie dress code. The entire global elite gathered in the hall, including Hollywood stars. For example, Kirk Douglas was there. 7 paintings by Impressionists, including Monet, Van Gogh, and Cézanne, were sold in a record 21 minutes. They fetched astronomical sums for those times, which seem almost laughable by today's standards. £781,000 sterling, which is about 30 million. The 1950s and 1960s in the US saw the emergence of pop art and abstract expressionism. A completely new movement, which, however, was met with great skepticism by both society and critics. The public saw it either as a mockery of common sense or as cynical commercial design, which in essence it actually was. The works of abstract expressionists and modern art in general were sold for relatively low prices. Their creators were still alive, which meant they continued to supply the market with their works, so no one could go above 10,000. Even 10 was a rare exception. Willem de Kooning's first solo exhibition in 1948 had zero commercial success. The paintings were priced between $200 and $800, which is about $2,500 to $10,800 today, but there were hardly any buyers. Mark Rothko in the mid-1950s was selling for an average of $1,200 to $3,000. In 1954, Pollock, who was desperately in need of money for drinking and living expenses, sold the giant canvas blue poles to a collector. To engineer Fred Olson for only $6,000, about $70,000 today. Just 3 years later, in 1957, after Pollock's tragic death in a car accident in 1956, the same canvas was resold to collector Ben Heller for a record-breaking $32,000 at the time, about $350,000 today. This deal shocked the art community. No one believed that anyone would pay the price of a good country villa for an American modernist for these splashes on canvas. I'll have videos on all of them, so subscribe to stay updated. However, abstract expressionism and pop art were the first movements in history that originated in the United States. They were America's first homegrown art movements. This was the peak of the Cold War, when the United States was competing with the USSR for the position of ethical and financial leader of the world. Art was one area where the United States competed for superpower influence. Now, I will tell you a story that may sound like a conspiracy theory or some kind of spy thriller, but there is plenty of evidence and investigations proving that this is exactly how it happened. The CIA enters the game. For years, the idea that American intelligence agencies influenced the recognition of abstract expressionism was just a rumor in the art world. However, today this secret campaign, known as the Cultural Cold War, is fully documented and proven. The CIA created an entire network of cultural foundations through a chain of front organizations whose goal was to promote new American art in Europe. The artists themselves didn't even know about it. Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and William de Kooning were left-wing intellectuals, anarchists, and anti-militarists. They sincerely hated the American government, conservatism, the McCarthy era, and the FBI. The CIA never paid them directly, never hired them, never dictated what to paint. The artists were used without their knowledge. CIA money was laundered through dozens of real and fictitious charitable organizations. The most famous was the Farfield Foundation, created by the intelligence agencies. When the prestigious Tate Gallery in London or the National Museum in Paris didn't have the funds to hold an American avant-garde exhibition, a generous American patron, Julius Fleischmann, would suddenly appear. He was the nominal head of the Farfield Foundation, but in reality, a CIA agent, and he covered all the costs for transporting the paintings and insurance. The organization, established in Paris in 1950 under the auspices of the CIA, coordinated the cultural life of Europe. Under its patronage, dozens of highly influential intellectual magazines were published, which constantly praised abstract expressionism and criticized Soviet socialist realism for its lack of freedom. MoMA in New York was also an unofficial CIA partner in this operation. When the US State Department officially refused to send Pollock's works to the Venice Biennale because of attacks from conservative congressmen who considered abstraction to be communist scribbling. MoMA, using supposedly private funds, would buy out the American pavilions and ship the exhibitions itself. The money for this came through the same intelligence channels. The most absurd and curious aspect of the involvement of American intelligence agencies in promoting abstract expressionism is that in the 1950s, different US departments were waging war against each other over the same artists. While the CIA was secretly spending millions of dollars to exhibit Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko in Paris and London as symbols of American freedom, the FBI, under the leadership of Edgar Hoover, was opening criminal cases against these same artists, while conservative congressmen were publicly declaring their art a communist conspiracy. A surreal situation developed, worthy of a spy comedy. Mark Rothko, a committed anarchist, sits in his studio, drinks cheap whiskey, and curses the American capitalist government and intelligence agencies, which, as he suspects, and not without reason, are watching him. FBI agents are stationed outside his windows and checking his tax returns, trying to accuse him of anti-American activities. On the same day, CIA agents, through a front foundation, secretly transfer a huge sum to the account of the Museum of Modern Art to pay for the insurance and transportation of Rothko's giant canvases to Paris in first class. Artists went to European exhibitions organized with CIA money without even suspecting it. They sincerely believed that they were being promoted by private patrons. Soon I will tell you about this American intelligence operation. Subscribe so you don't miss it. It's very interesting. The CIA's involvement in promoting the avant-garde is one of the most successful and subtle propaganda operations of the 20th century. The intelligence agencies neither created the style nor paid the artists. They simply built and funded the infrastructure that made these artists world famous. Without CIA money, abstract expressionism would most likely have remained a local New York phenomenon rather than becoming a major milestone in world art. And the art world, watching as this incomprehensible art, this scribble, constantly appeared in exhibitions and museum collections and was bought by millionaires, began to believe that there must be something to it. And that's when the emperor's new clothes effect began, where everyone acknowledges the value of an object, but no one can explain why. And then something happened that answered all the questions, although in a rather peculiar way. Such an event was the auction of the taxi magnate Robert Scull in October 1973 in New York. Scull was one of the first who in the 50s and 60s bought pop art and abstraction for pennies directly from the artist's studios, often for $100 or $500. In 1973, he put his collection up for auction at Sotheby's. The results shocked the world. The painting Thaw by Robert Rauschenberg, which Scull bought for $900, sold for $85,000. Jasper Johns' work, Double White Map, which cost the owner $10,200, was sold for a record $240,000. The amounts were actually small, but the returns were fantastic. The difference between purchase and sale prices indicated an outstanding investment. In 15 years, the paintings increased in value by 85 times, providing a return of up to 600% per year. No other business in the world provided such astronomical returns. At the same time, the entry threshold was still very low, just a few $1,000s. And all the investors in the world piled into this bonanza, everyone who had at least a couple dozen thousand spare dollars. Prices started to rise, and the CIA's bet paid off. By the 1980s, the situation resembled a perfect storm. On one hand, there was already institutional recognition of the new art. On the other hand, there was money ready to be spent on it as an investment. And you might be surprised again, but Japan enters the game. In the 1980s, Japan became the number 2 economy in the world. The Japanese had so much money that they didn't know what to do with it. The Japanese invented Zeitek, a form of financial speculation, and they started using art as collateral to get large loans. They bought Western art in bulk, ignoring price tags, assuming its value would rise. That's more profitable than stocks or bonds. It was the huge inflow of Japanese money that drove up the prices. First for the Impressionists, raising Van Gogh to $39 million, and then the wave reached living American modernists like de Kooning. In 1988, sales set new records. Jasper Johns' False Start from 1959 was sold for $17 million. The amount of $70 million adjusted for inflation is about $45 million today. The sale of a painting by a living artist landed like a bombshell. The public couldn't understand how an abstraction with chaotic colored spots and color names written on top could be worth more than most masterpieces of classical art. But just a year after Jones's record, de Kooning's huge expressionist abstraction, Exchange, from 1955, broke through the psychological barrier of 20 million as well. Today, that's equivalent to about 50 million. And the market saw that this wasn't just someone's spontaneous purchase, it was already a system. After the Japanese financial market burst in 1990, the art market plunged into a prolonged recession. Prices fell by 40 to 50% and a lull set in. A new, truly global and insane surge in the price of contemporary art occurred in the mid-2000s. It continues to this day. In the early 2000s, new ultra-wealthy individuals entered the market. American hedge fund managers Steve Cohen and Ken Griffin, as well as first-wave Russian oligarchs and Qatari sheikhs. Art finally turned into a global financial asset. That's when new stars of shock marketing were born, Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons. In 2007, Hirst sold his pill installation, Lullaby Spring, for $19.2 million. That same year, Koons sold a giant steel heart for $23.6 million. By the late 2010s, the prices for works by living artists had come close to the historic absolute records of the old masters. In November 2018, the British master David Hockney set a new record. His painting, Portrait of an Artist, Pool with 2 figures, is sold at Christie's for an incredible $93 million. In May 2019, Jeff Koons regains the crown of the most expensive artist. His stainless steel sculpture Rabbit is auctioned off for $91.1 million. Now, out of the top 10 most expensive paintings in history, 3 are abstract expressionist works from the 1950s and 60s, and the most expensive one is even in second place. This is Willem de Kooning's Interchange, which was auctioned off for $300 million. Only Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi is more expensive, at $450 million. And it would seem that pop art, ready-made, and abstract expressionism went through the same stages as all other art movements: Impressionism, Cubism, Fauvism, and so on, from complete disregard to commercial success. However, there's one key difference. The price and value of this art became so high not as a result of society recognizing its aesthetic, historical, or cultural value, but because of artificially created commercial appeal. Very influential institutions, for various reasons, promoted new American art, sold it to each other, and invested huge amounts of money into this business until they convinced the art world of its commercial potential. For the first time in the history of art, they skipped a very important step: the aesthetic recognition of the new approach. That's why even now there is still this huge gap between the price and the understanding of where it came from. Because no art historian can explain to you why this particular Pollock painting is good, or why it's better than this one or that one, without mentioning the artist's name, its history, or its sale price. Over the past 10 years, there has been a tremendous accumulation of private capital in the world. A huge number of billionaires have emerged from the US, China, the Persian Gulf countries, and the tech sector. The world's first billionaire appeared very recently, just 10 years ago in 2016. It was John Rockefeller. And today there are already 3,500 of them, with a total wealth of $20 trillion. Elon Musk is aiming for a fortune of $1 trillion. $1 million is just 1/1,000,000th of his fortune. It's like $1 to a millionaire. He, and not only him, can afford a painting even for $1 billion. When a person already has everything, super yachts, penthouses in every capital, and private jets, it becomes hard to find anything else to buy, to emphasize their status, to stand out from other rich people. Art becomes an elite trophy here and perfectly solves this problem. Buying a Jackson Pollock for $180 million, a record in May 2014, is a way to enter the most exclusive elite club on the planet. That's not too expensive if you have hundreds of billions in your accounts. Art has turned into a tool of prestige. There simply aren't any things in the world that are as expensive and exclusive as art. Old masters, meanwhile, appear on the market very rarely. They've long been bought up by museums, so in the list of the most expensive paintings, we see a lot of contemporary art, the price of which seems ridiculously sky high to us. The art market is very simple nowadays. Museums sit at its top. They carefully scan the field in search of new artists and determine the quality of art. For an artist, getting into a museum means never having to prove their professional worth again. Once an artist's name is in a major museum, anything they create becomes highly valuable, regardless of what it is or how it was made. Such an artist becomes untouchable, independent from institutions, critics, and especially from the audience, occupying a place as elevated as the museum itself. On the second tier sit the auction houses in partnership with art dealers. They shape and drive up the price of art by putting up rare lots as objects for the wealthy to fight over. On the third tier are the galleries, gallerists, and art experts. They act as a filter, sifting through everything on the market in search of the most promising artists. They organize exhibitions and PR campaigns for them, helping them build a name. Without their say-so, their approval, and their involvement, it's simply impossible for a young artist to rise higher. The same goes for Saatchi Art, the largest, most influential, and commercially successful gallery in the world, which has already become de facto an institution handing out golden awards, just like the Academy used to be. And at the very lowest level are unknown artists. They do everything they can to get noticed and impress dealers and gallery owners, mostly generating thousands of pieces of mediocre work, which is far from real art, because it's almost impossible to stand out now. All options have been tried. Repeating them interests no one. The modern art world is an artificially created commercial conveyor belt where there is no place for aesthetics. Or rather, it's secondary. That's exactly why you so often feel that disconnect when you look at this painting and see that it's priced at 70 million. Of course, it's not really worth that much. But that's how much the feeling of prestige from owning something with a famous name on it costs. That's the price of admission to the global elite of art collectors. That's how much a painting that now has precedent-setting, if not historic value costs. And that's the price of the opportunity to sell it in 10 years for 200 million. And if I had a couple $100 million, the first thing I'd do is buy some scribble with a famous name so I could sell it for more in a few years. So don't be surprised by the price of contemporary art. It doesn't reflect its aesthetic value at all. And your taste is just fine, don't worry. But there are real gems in contemporary art too. Banksy, Anish Kapoor, Maurizio Cattelan, Flora Yuknovich, a fantastic young star. There are a lot of them. And if you stay with me, I will definitely tell you about them. And you'll be able to tell real art from scribbles at first glance. Subscribe. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project that requires me to craft an interesting narrative, sometimes select up to 500 photos, arrange them correctly, and add captions. It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity. I'll keep doing this, but your support would be really helpful to me. Please become a sponsor of the channel here on YouTube, or even sign up for even the smallest membership on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you for watching.